podcasting from sunny Phoenix, Arizona. Welcome to Tips for Tour Operators, your podcast for growth hacks, marketing tips, and actionable insights from leading experts in the tourism industry. Welcome, everybody, to the Tips for Tour Operators podcast. I'm Dustin Hoyman, your host, and today we have a very special guest. I'm very excited. Straight from the arrival stage, we have Akila from Atlanta Food Walks. Akila, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast. You and I were talking a little bit ago. You spoke at Arrival, and you talked about storytelling, and I heard from several people it was just an impactful talk, and they actually went back home and they looked at their own situations about storytelling as well as inclusivity and just how to integrate that into a better situation for their tour. And so I think what we're going to talk about today is going to really help people, especially with the storytelling. But I think it's going to be really beneficial for everyone out there listening.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Excited to be on here.
Well, thank you. So to get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I am a recovering attorney. I always tell people I'm from Alabama, actually, and I went to law school, and I had this idea, I was going to be a lawyer, but about 3 years into my legal practice, I just hated it. It just was not me. And so I have the most understanding husband on the planet. I convinced him that we should both quit our jobs and travel around the world. And the original plan was we were going to travel for about 6 months. But a month in, I discovered something that changed my life. I discovered that people love stories. And that's actually what I talked about on Arrival. And how I discovered this is that I was just writing for the fun of it. I was writing blog posts about the stories that we were experiencing about eating kangaroo tail with Aborigines and hiking glaciers in New Zealand. And people loved those stories. And literally a month after I started my blog, this was back in 2007, where blogging was still a relatively new concept. There weren't very many food and travel bloggers out there. I started getting picked up by major newspapers and magazines. The LA Times wrote up about us, and people were just really excited to hear what we had to say, traveling around the world, writing about food. And so I was able to transform this passion for food and travel into a career as a food and travel writer. And we traveled for another 3.5 years. It was amazing. It was incredible. I really focused mostly on food. That was our big thing, was just exploring food and the stories associated with food. And I got home in 2015 back to Atlanta, and I found out I was pregnant. And when I was just upset in a way, because here I had this awesome career as a food and travel writer, but I couldn't travel anymore because I was 6 months pregnant. And then, after the baby is born, I was like, okay, I'm not going to be doing traveling for a while. So I thought to myself, well, the next best thing to traveling is introducing travelers to my city. And that is how Atlanta Food Walks was born.
Yeah, that's really, really incredible. When you were talking about that, you started out with, it sounded like a hobby, but it was really a passion that just turned into a surprise of a career. That's really great.
Yeah, it totally was. And, it's always funny because I always hear people saying, oh, well, follow your passion and follow your dreams. For me, it was totally accidental. This was just something I love to do. I would have written about food and travel just for free, for fun. But I guess I was good at it. And so people started hiring me. So,
Oh, that's really great. So that led you to starting Atlanta Food Walks. And did you know that storytelling was going to be a big part of your tour when you started Atlanta Food Walks?
Yes, absolutely. I, as a food and travel writer, I had taken probably hundreds of tours, food tours, art tours, architecture tours, every type of tour that you can think of, history tours. And we'd taken tons of them, partly because I was writing about them, partly because I just enjoy taking tours. I like learning about a city by locals. To me, that's the most interesting part of travel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've taken all these tours, and in my mind, out of these hundreds of tours, there were maybe less than a handful, maybe 5 or less, that really impacted me, where I remembered everything about that tour, where those tours just captured me, and I raved about them to everybody who would listen to me. And in every single one of those tours, it was the storytelling. The food might have been great, the places might have been cool, but at the core of it, it was just really profound storytelling that got to me. And so I knew I wanted to include that in our tours.
So what is the difference between, if somebody has a food tour and it's like great food, great location, the guide is probably really knowledgeable. What's the difference between that and having a great story? Like, can you kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure. So I think at the core of it, if you talk to any writer, they're going to tell you the same thing. You say, okay, what's a story? It's what we all learned back in the 5th grade. 5th grade English. I don't know if you remember, but you learned, at the beginning, you get this hook, and then there is a rising exposition, and then there's a climax, and then there's a resolution and a happily ever after, hopefully. I mean, this is the way the stories have been structured since literally the dawn of time. I mean, if you look at the Iliad and the Odyssey, this is the way that those stories are structured up until, Harry Potter today, or anything that you watch on TV. If you watch This Is Us, if you watch any shows, any movies that are really profound, they all follow this structure. It's the hook, the rising exposition, the climax, and then the resolution. But in the tour industry, very, very, very few of us utilize this structure. Most of us instead utilize an anecdotal structure, which is basically you tell them something, you tell your guests an interesting fact, but then it's not related to anything else that you've told them before and after. And we as human beings are kind of not wired to learn and remember that way. It's hard for us to process a lot of information if it's just random pieces of information. If it's like me telling you, hey, Dustin, so I went to Antarctica, and I also went to China, and I also went to Australia. Even a minute later, if I asked you to repeat back to me those 3 places that I told you, you might not remember, because we as humans have a very difficult time remembering things that don't really follow that nice chronological sequence.
Yeah, that's really, really powerful. So you're basically saying, build your story structure into the tour versus just saying facts and saying, listing things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the simplest example of this is if you read a lot, and I love to read. I love reading books, and I love reading fiction, especially. It is truly remarkable to me the ability I have to remember random details from The Lord of the Rings or from Harry Potter. I mean, I can tell you like the names of secondary and tertiary characters in Harry Potter. But if you ask me to tell you, what's the name of my next door neighbor? I have a hard time telling you that, but it's because, they created a story and you follow along in that whole story. It's not just a random fact. I mean, and isn't that terrible that we don't know our neighbors' names, but we remember like Luna Lovegood, I mean, it's just crazy.
Yeah. I mean, it's almost like the story, the framework of the story gives context, and that context helps you just like, you understand the relationships, and humans like relationships. So can you give me an example? Exactly. Yeah. Can you give me an example of how you use the storytelling structure with Atlanta Food Walks?
Yeah. So all of our tours are built around a story. So we utilize this narrative structure in our tours. And actually, when I talk to my guides and when I'm teaching my guides about, training them, I force them to basically think about our tour like a book. So each time that we stop somewhere on the tour and talk about, a certain part of that tour, that's a chapter of the book. So we start with chapter 1. So chapter 1 is the hook. That's the part that's going to, get them excited. And our downtown tour, I told you guys that hook on that downtown tour at arrival. And I swear to you, before we have gone inside to eat anything, before I've shown them anything, just the story alone, people will start patting each other on the back and saying, wow, you did a great job booking this. It's just the hook. So it's that, for us, it's, every chapter, every time that we stop, is like a chapter in that story. So, our downtown tour, for example, we start with the story. The whole story is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as a foodie. We start with him as a very young boy. And then we, go to the lunch counter sit-ins, and we're standing at the steps where he was arrested. And then we wind up with his death in front of the funeral home where he was, where his body was prepared. And along the way, there's this strand of the story, which is that Dr. King was a foodie. I think the thing that people always say to me is like, oh my gosh, because I explain this and people say, man, this is so much work to create all of this, right? And it is, but it's actually in some ways less work than you might think, because the bottom line is reading through all your facts and finding the common threads. And there are always common threads. I mean, your story might not be about Martin Luther King Jr. Your story might be about how the city of Seattle has been, a great place for opportunity, or maybe it's how, the gold rush completely changed California. I mean, there are stories everywhere. It's just finding those threads and piecing them together.
Okay, that's really powerful. So you basically take, the different facts that you're probably telling on your tour anyways, finding that common thread and then just stringing them along and following that structure, your typical story structure that, like you said, everyone knows. Is what you learn in English class when you're young. So everyone really understands it. So can you speak to like someone taking your tour? Like you had mentioned in the beginning, like from chapter 1, people are starting to, feel that story structure. So it's like, what's the impact on a person taking the tour when you have that story structure?
Oh, I mean, it changes everything. I think there's a couple of things that to me is really astonishing. The first is that our return rate is phenomenal. I mean, we've been in business now for 3 years, and we have people who have come back 3, 4, 5 times. Wow. So they're basically coming back every year. We had a guy just recently who he came once, he came again, and then the third time he brought 10 of his coworkers from his office. And what was particularly interesting was he was taking the same tours. It wasn't different tours each time. He was taking the same tour, and he remembered the history that he had heard almost a year ago. Wow. That, to me, that impact, I mean, number one, the ability to remember things is amazing. That's great. That's how we learn. But the second thing is, if I can tell you a story in one sentence, then I can persuade you to buy that. Like if I can tell you, like, I think Uber probably has one of the greatest stories, right? They have this really great concept, which is everyone can be a taxi. That's it. That's their story. And it's awesome. I can explain to you in one sentence, the concept of Uber is everyone can be a taxi. That's awesome. That's awesome storytelling. On the other hand, if I tell you, oh, well, there's this really cool tour in Atlanta, and then somebody says, oh, why is it cool? And I'm like, well, we did a whole lot of eating, we did some walking, and you're like, okay, what is this? On the other hand, if I tell you there's this really cool tour in Atlanta where we learned that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he actually was a foodie. That's it. That's in one sentence. You take it away. It's like it's that awesome word of mouth marketing.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, is that you almost empower the people on the tour to remember the details. So they're not saying, oh, it's really great, because, that doesn't mean anything to anybody. It's hard to explain why something is great. You're just like, oh, it's good. And you're like, okay, but why? But it sounds like they can become involved in the story, and almost like a really great movie, like you just want to talk about it.
Exactly. That's exactly it. And the thing that I think is amazing, that, and I've taken so many tours. The best tour I've ever taken was one in Rome. And it was a tour with Context Tours, which puts on some really fantastic tours.
Mm-hmm.
And this guide, I mean, I took this tour 12 years ago. I can still tell you the story that he told us was about how the Vatican Museums was a dispute, basically between Michelangelo and Raphael. In one sentence, I can explain that tour to you. I took that tour 12 years ago. It's still stuck in my head. I mean, that's the power of storytelling. And if I can explain it to you and I remember the name of the company, then when you go to Rome next time, you're going to be like, oh, I'm going to look up this tour where Michelangelo and Raphael actually competed against each other. I mean, it's awesome. That's awesome marketing.
Yeah, that sounds really incredible. So like, on the tour itself, storytelling just makes that great, and it turns into business because you can do the word of mouth marketing. So that sounds like during the tour, there's a lot of storytelling that's involved, and that impacts after the tour. What about before the tour? Is there any storytelling you can start in the beginning? Maybe in the marketing?
Absolutely. There's 3 types of storytelling, right? So there's the oral storytelling, which is what I was just talking to you about. That's what we're doing on the tour. But you're not going to really get that oral storytelling until you get on our tour. So before we even get to this oral storytelling part, we have the visual storytelling. And that's really the marketing end. And then associated with that visual storytelling is the written storytelling. Again, also that marketing end. It's the copy that we're using in our website. It's the copy that we're using in our blog posts. All 3 of these things work together to create a cumulative product. I think something to me that surprises me is in our TripAdvisor reviews, we will get people who will say, this is a really professional company from start to finish. They did this, and they'll tell us, here. Then they'll go into the details, but the point is, if you're looking at your whole storytelling, your visual, your written, your oral, are you conveying what you want to be conveying? And maybe that's not being professional. I mean, maybe what you're trying to convey is that you're fun. And maybe your storytelling is about how, Virginia was basically a big drunken party back in the Revolutionary time period. And if that's your story, awesome. And then you promote that story in your visual and your oral and your written storytelling. But it's knowing what you want to project and then utilizing that storytelling to project that.
So what are some of the differences between those different types of storytelling? Like a guide might be a really good storyteller, leading a group, but are they good at writing content for your website?
Yeah. So I don't mix and match personally.
Okay.
I think it's very rare to find great written storytellers who are also great oral storytellers. I mean, they exist, but they're kind of the unicorns out there, they're hard to find. And I'll tell you, I practiced law for a while. I worked for a federal judge. And what is actually fascinating in the legal world, because, lawyers, all we do is we communicate. I mean, that's our job is to communicate. Either you're communicating orally or you're communicating written. And you can't tell when you watch shows like Law and Order, but most big law firms have 2 teams of people on every case. One team of people just handles the writing. One team of people handles the oral, the talking, because they're 2 totally different skill sets. You can be a phenomenal writer and be a pretty lousy speaker. Vice versa, you can be a phenomenal speaker and be a pretty lousy writer. So I think it's about knowing what your skill set is. When I hire my tour guides, I could care less whether or not they can write. I mean, it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
What matters to me is whether or not they can talk and tell a story and engage. On the other hand, when I'm hiring my writers, I could care less whether they can talk. As long as they can talk to me, they can sit in their office with just their computer and they can just write. And that's great, you know?
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. A writer is probably a little bit more introverted, whereas the tour guides, somebody can tell a good story. They probably rely on that interaction with people and seeing the faces and reading the room a little bit more. So I can see how those skills are different.
Yeah, I mean, there's that. I think the other thing too is that in oral storytelling, you really have to pare things down. You don't have the space to explain things as much as you do in written storytelling. With written storytelling, in just like maybe 2 pages, you can convey a ton of information.
Mm-hmm.
You can't convey that same amount of information. I think that's the reason why people are they always complain. They say, oh well, the book was better than the movie. Well, it's 2 different forms of storytelling. And when you're trying to cram the information that's in a book into this oral and visual storytelling format, it doesn't always work. The best movies, in my opinion, and I think many people's opinions, are the movies that were written to be movies.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That's the structure. Same thing, the books tend to be better when they're meant to be books,
Yeah, that's a really great analogy, because there's the same thing. Every time you read those books, you get into the depths of the characters and the stories, and like the world seems to be so much bigger, and you're not going to sit through an 8-hour movie to get all that detail.
The last 4 months, I actually have been writing a book about Atlanta's culinary history. And what is, several of my guides actually were early readers of my books. And one of my guides made this comment to me, which I thought was a really profound comment. She said to me, wow, there's so much information in the book that I don't include in our tours. And I was like, yeah, that's because our tour scripts they're meant to be for oral storytelling. They're not meant to be written storytelling. So on the writing side, we can, include a lot more than we can on the oral side. And, the separate thing from this is that in written storytelling, you can be a whole lot more blunt than you can be in oral storytelling. In oral storytelling, you have to be much more tactful when you're thinking about the ways in which you convey information to other people.
Can you give me an example of that?
Sure. So a really good example of this is, it's actually interesting. After I gave my speech at Arrival, I had so many people. I mean, I can't even tell you how many people, probably at least 15 to 20 people come up to me and say, listen, we have this very tricky issue in our city. Maybe it's that they have Confederate monuments. Maybe they're a city that used to have plantations. Maybe they're a city that had a really terrible race riot. And every single person said to me, well, how do we talk about that tactfully? Because right now we're just kind of glossing over it because it's uncomfortable. It's very, very uncomfortable. So with oral storytelling, the trick that I always use when we're talking about uncomfortable things is we apologize and then move on. So like, for example, on our downtown tour, we talk a lot about the impact that slaves had on Southern cuisine. That, for a very long time in the South, slaves were doing the cooking. And what we say is we apologize. We say, look, we know that slavery is an awkward and uncomfortable topic on a fun food tour. And then we dive into it, because then we say, but the fact of the matter is that slaves were the ones who were responsible for most of the cooking in the Deep South for a very long time. So we use that apologizing a lot in oral storytelling. I mean, if you ever watch like the State of the Union address or any of these like great like politicians talk, you'll see them, they'll very frequently apologize and then move on. They'll say, look, we know this isn't something people usually talk about, but move on. But with written storytelling, you don't have to apologize. You just lay it out there and people expect it. So it's just different ways in which we communicate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's almost like using empathy as a way to say, I know you feel uncomfortable. We feel uncomfortable too, to put you on the same side. It's like softening that edge a little bit. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it's using empathy, but more than using empathy, it's saying, it's addressing the elephant that's in the middle of that room. It's basically saying, hey, we get the fact that people don't normally talk about the KKK, but we're going to do that because the story is important. So one thing that happens when you apologize and then move into it is that you transform everybody in your audience into being a good guy. I mean, this is, I think, maybe a separate like side note, and maybe maybe getting off onto a tangent, but I think one of the major problems with storytelling is how do you as an audience feel about that story? Do you empathize with the protagonist? Because the ultimate point of storytelling, I mean, the reason why we as humans are wired to learn using this narrative structure is because of empathy. I mean, there have been scientific tests done that actually show that if you put two groups of people into a room, in one group, you just show them a picture of a boy and a man walking. And then at the end of like 5 minutes, you give those people $10. Most people will just walk away with the $10. On the other hand, if you bring a second group into the room and you show them the same video of the boy and the man walking, and you tell them a very moving story about how this little boy actually has cancer, how the father is tackling this extremely difficult issue. How do you have fun with the child as well as also be the parent, knowing this doom that is upon the child. And if you give that same another group of people that $10, 50% of them will donate that money to a charitable organization, to a cancer society. It's the storytelling. I mean, same thing. There have been studies done that actually show that if you have an object and you put one object for sale for $5, nobody buys it. If you then attach a story to that object, a moving story in which people are empathizing, the price of that object will actually go up by almost like 5 times. That same object will sell for $25. So, back to, your question, which is making everybody a part of this shared group, by using that apology, we're forcing everybody to empathize with each other, to make them all feel like we're in this world together. We're in this world as a shared community, and they walk away feeling good and positive and like they want to buy more, which is awesome.
Yeah, that is awesome.
So yeah, I mean, it's I think the science associated with empathy and storytelling is really profound and is kind of being ignored in the tourism industry. I mean, it's really, really well known in the marketing world, but people in the tourism industry aren't exploiting this as much as they should be, because we're communicators and we should be exploiting this much more.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think it's really, people think about providing a great experience, and that great experience is shared, in different people's minds. And it sounds like, using that story gives you a foundation of, like you said, almost like community. Like you are now a part of the story because you went on this tour. Like you said, you took that tour in Rome, which sounds amazing, by the way. I mean, it was an amazing tour. It really was. Yeah, that sounds awesome. but it gives you that sense of like, now I'm a part of this, and you can share that because you're a part of it. And
Mhm.
I mean, that can probably work from an ATV tour through the desert, or a food tour in Atlanta, or
Absolutely.
an art tour in Rome. That same sort of structure works.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the other thing that is always interesting to me is a lot of the adventure tour companies, right? Like the bungee tours and the ATV tours, they all will say, well, we're not really about history. You don't have to be about history. Storytelling is not at all about history specifically. I mean, sure, there can be a historical element, but when you think about the great marketers like Coca-Cola and, Nike, they are selling a story. I mean, they're selling a story in a very, very compact way. I mean, I think a Coca-Cola is like, for a long time it was, the smile Coca-Cola.
Hmm.
So like that story they're immediately selling is, you drink Coca-Cola and you'll be happy.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I
Yeah.
mean, what an amazing story that they're creating. I think Nike has always sold this just do it, that if you are going to be somebody, you are just going to do it. It's not even about athletics. It's just about, being that person that goes out there and perseveres and does it.
So I'm going to challenge you a little bit. I'm going to put you on the spot,
Sure.
because I think you hit on something. I think that people, a lot of times, are like, well, this is great, and it's like great for your tour, but I'm a zip line. How do I use
Yeah.
storytelling in a zip line? Like, off the top of your head, could you maybe craft a way that a zip line could use
Sure.
storytelling?
Sure. I mean, I went on a really cool when I was in Costa Rica a couple of years ago. I went on a ziplining tour, and it was amazing. And there's totally a story to be told, and the story that they could have told is that you're flying over the trees. And you think to yourself, okay, well, why does that matter?
Mhm.
Why does it matter if I'm flying over the trees? Well, look. First of all, this is a environment that hardly any of us ever get to see.
Mhm.
What we're normally seeing when we're looking at trees is we're down on the ground. We're not looking. I mean, I guess you can look up, but most of us aren't really looking up. You're looking ahead of you and walking through it. So if you're flying over the trees, man, it's like you're Superman. You're going there. You get this vision of the world that nobody else gets to see. And to me, like in Costa Rica, it was actually very interesting because the guide would say things like, oh, well, this is an interesting leaf, or this is an interesting, um, you know, I don't know anything about plants at all. So, they would be like, this is an interesting tree. And I'd be like, oh, okay, so why is it interesting? But if you can capture that and tell me, hey, look, you're flying, you're seeing something that nobody else can see, that nobody else sees, that's powerful. It's something that will stick in your mind.
Yeah. I mean, that's like you said, it's like you're Superman. Like, how many people they say, pick a superpower, and how many people say, I want to go, I want to be able to fly. And I mean, that's really great. I mean, you didn't even have to think twice about that.
Well, I mean, I think for me, I'm always looking for the stories, right?
Mhm.
And and it was actually funny because a couple of years ago, I went on this awesome food tour. And at the end of the food tour, I was like, this was such a fun food tour. And all they needed was just to wrap it up in a story that you can sell your audience. And you tell them that story every single time. So like, for example, with our tour, if you look at our marketing, the first thing that you read about our downtown tour is that Martin Luther King Jr. was a foodie. When you walk in, one of the first stories that we tell is about how he's a foodie. Then at the 3/4 point, we say, look, I mean, we kind of explicitly say, and MLK was a foodie. And then at the end, we again wrap it up. We're using that same terminology over and over again. the best part is that our reviewers come back and they say, the best part of this tour was that I learned that Martin Luther King Jr. was a foodie just like me. You know, they're selling that story. So yeah, you just use that terminology, you figure out what your story is, you use it in your marketing on the front end, you use it throughout your tour, you use it on your back end, and people will buy into it. I mean, it's, you know, it's just do it. Everybody knows what that slogan is because they've done such a good job with the storytelling.
Yeah, it sounds like too, you brought up a fairly important point is, you know, once you have that story and you figure that part out, you do have a narrative. And then once you have that narrative, you can be consistent in promoting that message. And so that consistency is probably the biggest part. I mean, if you saw Just Do It, like one time it was Just Do It, and the next time was go ahead and, you know, or like another one's like Carpe Diem, like they're all different messaging. But when you have that consistency and you have that figured out, it sounds like that would be powerful as well.
Yeah, the consistency is powerful. The other thing that's also, I think, what I have found that's really valuable with the utilizing the narrative structure is the buy-in from my guides. Because, you know, ultimately, I'm not out there giving tours. It's my guides who are out there giving tours, right? And if our guides really buy into what we're doing, that's phenomenal. And by utilizing this narrative structure, by utilizing something that they feel passionate about, they empathize with our protagonists, well, then they're so much more convincing when they're telling those stories. And it's not just, you know, I don't need you to be a historian to come and be one of my guides. I just need you to be a human being who loves to talk. Because then I'm going to tell you the story. You're going to fall in love with that story so much that you can't wait to tell that story to everybody else out there.
Yeah, that's a really good point too. Like getting that buy-in and having people that, you know, they're your passion as everything that you've done turns into their passion, and then their passion turns into the guest's passion. And then that just, everything is just amplified. Wow. So one of the things too, you know, kind of shifting a little bit here, is you talked about a lot between like oral versus written. So on the marketing standpoint, visuals are a big part of that too, being pictures and video. You know, how do you use that in your storytelling in the front end of your tour promotions and your marketing?
Yeah, so we have a corporate philosophy that our company should be intentionally inclusive, that everything that we do, we are moving towards this goal of being intentionally inclusive. And I think that's something very different than diverse. You know, we use this word diversity a lot. The problem is that you can be diverse and, you know, all the Black kids can be sitting on one side of the cafeteria and all the white kids can be sitting on the other side, and all the Asian kids can be sitting on the other side, and the Hispanic kids on the other side. Sure, you've got diversity, but you don't have inclusivity. So for us, this is about challenging us as a company. How do we tackle intentional inclusivity? And the way that we do it is, a lot of it is with our visual storytelling. So our oral storytelling, we are not a Black history tour, we're not a white history tour, and we're not an Asian history tour or a Hispanic history tour. We focus on Atlanta, and we're going to tell the whole story about Atlanta and all the people in Atlanta. But on the front end, from the visual storytelling, that means that when we take pictures of our groups to put on our websites, because, I mean, let's face it, maybe you have 20 pictures on your website maximum. I mean, maybe you have a little bit more, but for most of us, we max out at around 20 pictures. So when we are looking for those 20 pictures, we make sure that we are looking for inclusive groups with people of all races, people of all genders, people of all, you know, ages, all, you know, basically we're trying to have everybody fit the box. We're trying to be the Benetton ads of tours, you know, basically, and it works. Because that type of aspirational imagery actually results in actual diversity. And I mean, that's not just me saying it. There's loads and loads and loads of marketing research that that proves that point. But we have also anecdotally seen it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you and I were talking about it just a second ago. I was talking to somebody who led a food tour who saw you talk at Arrival. And she even mentioned, I never thought, like, are all of my customers middle-aged white women because of the marketing that I have? Would that be different if I had, was more intentionally inclusive and just seeing what that looks like? Am I excluding people just because, I wasn't so intentional about that?
Yeah, and I think, it's not necessarily excluding people. It's that we all tend to drift towards what we know. And I'm Indian, and my family, we grew up I grew up in Alabama, in which, like, the Indian population is, I don't know, 0.00001% of the population. I mean, it's a teeny tiny percent of the population there. And it's funny because my brother and I used to joke that if there was an Indian in Alabama, somehow or another, my parents would go and find that Indian and know them, because we gravitate towards what we know. I mean, I think, me personally, most of my friends tend to be Southerners. It's not just because I live in Atlanta, it's because those are the people I'm most comfortable with. And if you're looking at your website and you're saying, wait, how am I going to get something for everybody, then you want to represent everybody.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And especially when the storytelling aspect, the story isn't about you. And I think a lot of people, especially, tour operators and business owners, they see the world through their eyes.
Yeah.
Really, you need to twist that and see the world through somebody else's eyes. And that doesn't necessarily have to be your guest, because that's going to change, but that's where the story comes in. And you can view a story, and everybody sits and watches a movie or reads a book, and they read the same story. And so bringing that in and just kind of like pivoting the perspective sounds like what you're kind of saying is create that story, be a little bit more inclusive as far as, what that looks like inclusive not only probably from people, but as far as like different aspects of your tour. Would you say that's true as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think the intentional inclusivity part, that's so important. But the other thing too with the storytelling is, you're totally right. We all tend to look at things from our perspective, for better or for worse. But what's funny is I see so many websites where people will say, oh, we're the number one, ATV tour, we're the number one food tour, we're the number one whatever tour. And again, is that really what your customer cares about? Probably not. Sure, it's great that you're number one, but they want to know more. And so, I think there's like all of these layers to the very first thing, and you probably know this way better than me, Dustin, but there's all these layers to the first thing that somebody sees when they look at your website. The first is, the actual pictures that they're looking at. Are they looking at people that are diverse, that have everybody in there? Are they looking, what's the copy that they are looking at? Does the copy tell a story, or is the copy just telling them what you want to know, like what you as the tour operator are proud of? And of course, it's awesome if you're number one, but I don't think it convinces the guest of anything. I think the guest wants to know more. They want to know the story of why they should be taking your tour.
Yeah, that's a good point. Nobody's leaving a tour being like, I am so happy I went on the number one tour. You're number one for a reason, tell them that reason, not that.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's
yeah,
really
exactly.
So just to recap a little bit, I want to kind of wrap up a couple of the points, because there's a lot to unpack here. And I think, I want my whole staff to just listen to this, because I think it'll be great. But just a couple, yeah, it's great. But the biggest thing that I can see here as I was taking notes is everybody has a story to tell. Even in the people that's like, we use the zip line as example, and you said, people don't think that as a story to be told. It's just an activity. It's a physically exhilarating activity. But if you match that with a mentally enticing offer of being able to, like, using the zip line, fly over the trees, you're seeing something that nobody else
I
in the world
see
can
all these companies now that say flyer.
You're going to see it. Every zip line.
You and I should get a couple of royalties for that.
Yeah. So we're going to get your contact information, set your direct deposit, just get it go right in there.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, like find that theme, find that that message that's really important. Like just do it. It's really simple. It doesn't have to be complicated, but like what's the story you're trying to tell? So that's the biggest thing. And then also I really like that you had mentioned, unpacked the difference between oral storytelling versus written versus visual, and being really intentional about building those stories for those purposes. I think that's really powerful. Oral storytelling, you don't have a whole lot of time to get into every big detail. Whereas written, it sounds like you can get into that a little bit more.
Right. You absolutely can.
And then, of course, visual, making sure that supports the story structure and, being inclusive in what happens there. But really just like, to me, it sounds like you're saying like lead into the experience and just like support the story from a visual standpoint. So you can kind of get, people can see what they're about to experience, and then they match that with the storyline as well. Is there anything else that I missed in there? Is there anything that
No, I think that was a great recap. Great storytelling right there. You just put it all into a nice little summary.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that doesn't do it justice because there's so much good stuff in here. So I'm going to have to go back, and I'm excited to re-listen to this and think about my own marketing, what we do at Outdoor Adventure Marketing, and what are we doing for storytelling, because this is just so powerful. That's really great.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me. It was really fun.
If somebody wants to contact you, or if they want to reach you somehow, what's the best way for them to do so?
Sure. They can always reach me at Akila, Akila, at AtlantaFoodWalks.com. So I'm around. I love talking about stories. Just reach out to me if you have any questions. Love to talk about it further.
Well, great. Akila, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Dustin.
All right. Bye.